Hello everyone! Happy Friday! Are you ready for some more Wayside School? So if you remember, Wayside School was built sideways. So instead of one story with 30 classrooms, it's 30 stories tall with one classroom on each story, and most of our... Oh, do you see Scooty? There he is. Hey, what are you doing?
Hi.
And most of our stories come from the 30th story of Wayside School. So here we go. Chapter 3, Joe. Joe had curly hair, but he didn't know how much hair he had. He couldn't count that high. In fact, he couldn't count at all. When all the other children went to recess, Mrs. Jules told Joe to wait inside. "Joe," she said, "how much hair do you have?" Joe shrugged his shoulders. "A lot," he answered. "But how much, Joe?" asked Mrs. Jules. "Enough to cover my head," Joe answered. "Joe, you're going to have to learn how to count," said Mrs. Jules. "But Mrs. Jules, I already know how to count," said Joe. "Let me go to recess." "First count to 10, said Mrs. Jules. Joe counted to 10. 6, 8, 12, 1, 5, 2, 7, 11, 3, 10. "No, Joe, that is wrong," said Mrs. Jules. "No, it isn't," said Joe. "I counted until I got to 10. "But you were wrong," said Mrs. Jules. "I'll prove it to you." She put 5 pencils on his desk. "How many pencils do we have, Joe?" Joe counted the pencils. 4, 6, 1, 9, 5. "There are 5 pencils, Mrs. Jules." "That's wrong," said Mrs. Jules. "How many pencils are there?" Joe asked. 5, said Mrs. Jules. "That's what I said Joe. "May I go to recess now?" "No," said Mrs. Jules. "You got the right answer, but you counted the wrong way. You were just lucky." She set 8 potatoes on his desk. "How many potatoes, Joe?" Joe counted the potatoes. 7, 5, 3, 1, 2, 4, 6, 8. "There are 8 potatoes, Mrs. Jules." "No, there are 8, said Mrs. Jules. "But that's what I said Joe. "May I go to recess now?" "No, you got the right answer, but you counted the wrong way again." She put 3 books on his desk. "Count the books, Joe." Joe counted the books. 1,000, 1,000,000, 3. "There are 3, Mrs. Jules." "Correct," said Mrs. Jules. "May I go to recess now?" Joe asked. "No," said Mrs. Jules. "May I have a potato?" asked Joe. "No, listen to me. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, said Mrs. Jules. "Now you say it." 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, said Joe. "Very good," said Mrs. Jules. She put 6 erasers on his desk. "Now count the erasers, Joe, just the way I showed you." Joe counted the erasers. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. "There are 10, Mrs. Jules." "No," said Mrs. Jules. "Didn't I count right?" asked Joe. "Yes, you counted right, but you got the wrong answer," said Mrs. Jules. "This doesn't make any sense," said Joe. "When I count the wrong way, I get the right answer. When I count the right way, I get the wrong answer." Mrs. Jules hit her head against the wall 5 times. "How many times did I hit my head against the wall?" she asked. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. "You hit your head against the wall 10 times, said Joe. "No," said Mrs. Jules. 4, 6, 1, 9, 5. "You hit your head 5 times, said Joe. Mrs. Jules shook her head no and said, "Yes, that's right." The bell rang and all the other children came back from recess. The fresh air had made them very excited and they were laughing and shouting. "Ah, darn," said Joe. "Now I missed recess." "Hey, Joe, where were you?" asked John. "You missed a great game of kickball." "I kicked a home run," said Todd. "What was wrong with you, Joe?" asked Joy. "Nothing," said Joe. "Mrs. Jules was just trying to teach me how to count." Joy laughed. "You mean you don't know how to count?" "Counting is easy," said Maricia. Now, said Mrs. Jules, "what's easy for you may not be easy for Joe, and what's easy for Joe may not be easy for you." "Nothing's easy for Joe," said Maricia. "He's stupid." "I can beat you up," said Joe. "Try it," said Maricia. "That will be enough of that," said Mrs. Jules. She wrote Mauricia's name on the blackboard under the word discipline. Joe put his head on his desk between the 8 potatoes and the 6 erasers. "Don't feel bad, Joe," said Mrs. Jules. "I just don't get it," said Joe. "I'll never learn how to count." "Sure you will, Joe," said Mrs. Jules. "One day, it'll just come to you. You'll wake up one morning and suddenly be able to count." Joe asked, "If all I have to do is wake up, what am I going to school for?" "School just speeds things up," said Mrs. Jules. "Without school, it might take another 70 years before you wake up and are able to count." "By that time, I may have no hair left on top of my head to count," said Joe. "Exactly," said Mrs. Jules. "That's why you go to school." When Joe woke up the next day, he knew how to count. He had 55,006 hairs on his head. They were all curly. Chapter 4, Sherry. Sherry had long eyelashes. She weighed only 49 pounds. She always wore a big red and blue overcoat with a hood. The overcoat weighed 35 pounds. The red part weighed 15 pounds, the blue part weighed 15 pounds, and the hood weighed 5 pounds. Her eyelashes weighed 1.5 pounds. She sat next to the window in Mrs. Jules' class. She spent a lot of time just staring out the window. Mrs. Jules didn't mind. Mrs. Jules said that a lot of people learn best when they stare out a window. Sherry often fell asleep in class. Mrs. Jules didn't mind that either. She said a lot of people do their best learning when they are asleep. Sherry spent all of her time either looking out the window or sleeping. Mrs. Jules thought she was the best student in class. One afternoon, it was very hot. All of the windows were open, yet Sherry still wore her red and blue overcoat. The heat made her very tired. Mrs. Jules was teaching arithmetic. Sherry pulled the hood up over her face, buried herself in her coat, and went to sleep. "Mrs. Jules," said Kathy, "Sherry is asleep." "That's good," said Mrs. Jules. "She must be learning something." Sherry began to snore. "Mrs. Jules, Sherry is snoring," said Kathy. "Yes, I can hear her," said Mrs. Jules. "She must be learning an awful lot today. I wish the rest of you could be like her." Sherry began to toss and turn. She flopped over on top of her desk, then rolled over on top of Kathy's desk, then she rolled back the other way. "Ah!" Kathy screamed. Sherry rolled out the window. She was still sound asleep. As you know, Mrs. Jules' class was on the 30th story of Wayside School, so Sherry had a long way to go. After she had fallen 10 stories, Sherry woke up. She looked around. She was confused. She wasn't in Mrs. Jules' class, and she wasn't at home in bed. She couldn't figure out where she was. She yawned, pulled the hood back over her eyes, and went back to sleep. By that time, she had fallen another 10 stories. Wayside School had an exceptionally large playground. Lewis, the yard teacher, it's like the PE teacher, was way over on the other side of the playground when he happened to see Sherry fall out the window. He ducked under the volleyball net, hurtled past the kickball field, hopped over the hopscotch court, climbed through the monkey bars, sped across the grass, and caught Sherry just before she hit the ground. The people in Mrs. Jules' class cheered. Hooray! Sherry woke up in Lewis's arms. "Darn it, Lewis," she said, "what'd you go and wake me up for?" "I'm sorry, Sherry," said Lewis. I'm sorry, Sherry repeated. "Is that all you can say? I was having a wonderful dream until you woke me up. You're always bothering me, Lewis. I can't stand it." She laughed and hugged him around the neck. Lewis carried her back up 30 flights of stairs to Mrs. Jules' room. That evening, when Sherry went to bed, she was unable to fall asleep. She just wasn't tired. I wonder why. I don't know. Maybe you can figure it out. All right. That's all I'm going to read today. Just a couple chapters, short and sweet, just like you guys are. And I miss you guys a whole bunch. I don't know if I've told you that or not on the videos. And I hope you are enjoying the read alouds. Since I can't read to you in person, I am happy to continue this on my little videos. And I hope you're enjoying them when I send them out. And if not, that's okay too. All right, you guys, have a great weekend, and I will see you next week. Okay? Bye.